Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Deuteronomy 17. Moses has repeated a lot of the laws about not worshiping idols and doing justice. But how should these ordinances be carried out? How should things like the death penalty be carried out in cases of blatant sin? Why should God have to judge sin at all? Through investigating in this chapter, we get a rich understanding of how God relates to his people. At the end of it all, God will send one who can keep this law in all the areas that we can't, helping us and leading us to live the lives that God created us to live. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep which has a blemish or any defect, for that is a detestable thing to the Lord your God. This is a command that has been repeated a few times throughout the Torah so far. Remember that offering sacrifices was a way to give back to God all the blessings that he had poured onto the people. But it had to be something special, right? It had to cost the person something. They shouldn't offer up a sick ox or a sheep with a broken leg, because those animals wouldn't have been as valuable to the owner. So both as a way to revere God and make sure that your sacrifices were a sacrifice, only the best and most flawless animals were to be given as offerings. If there is found in your midst, in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God by transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon, or any of the heavenly host, which I have not commanded, and if it is told you, and you have heard of it, then you shall inquire thoroughly. Behold, if it is true, and the thing certain, that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed to your gates, that is, the man or woman, and you shall stone them to death. Once again, we see Moses insisting that the people refuse to follow idols when they enter the promised land. And he has said this over and over in Deuteronomy 4, 7, 12, and 13. But he knows that ultimately people will be seduced into worshiping these false gods, these false idols, just like their pagan neighbors. And so when that inevitably happens, what should the rest of Israel do to correct it? Moses commands that everyone in Israel stone these idolaters to death, and others who have broken God's covenant terms. Now we also remember from the last chapter that the people are required to be fair judges too. They need to refuse bribes. They need to always pursue truth and justice and righteousness. And so Moses commands that these charges should not be taken lightly, but they should be heavily investigated before condemning someone made in God's image to death. And as we get into more offenses listed in Deuteronomy, it is crucial that we realize why the law says what it says. The death penalty should not be about violence or bloodlust or mob mentality. It's about justice above all else. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. First, in any case where the death penalty is on the table, there needs to be at least 2 witnesses to the wrongdoing, and preferably 3. Moses here is repeating God's command from Numbers 35. Obviously, this is to keep a lid on false accusations spreading, which would lead to innocent people dying. And what it means is that even if someone did break God's covenant, even if someone did worship an idol, but there was only 1 witness to it, that person should not be put to death. They're to err on the side of grace. This commandment becomes a little bit of a minor theme in Jesus' trial in Matthew and Mark's Gospels. Matthew says that false charges came up against Jesus only because of collusion and corruption among witnesses. And Mark records that there was no consistency at all in any of the witnesses' statements. Regardless, God's intention with this command is so that justice is always done among his people, and so that death sentences are not given out lightly. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him, to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Another judgment that, in theory, should limit false accusations is that lead witnesses should be the first to act when commencing a stoning. This was mentioned briefly in Deuteronomy 13, and it works kind of like the Ned Stark principle, if you've ever seen Game of Thrones. The person who demands a death sentence, in this case the witnesses, they should be the ones who actually do the executing. This again will make witnesses really think about what they're about to do. It gives them a chance to recant if they've lied in their testimony, and in theory should limit false accusations. And notice the last phrase there. It's all done to purge the evil from their midst. Getting this is so important to understanding biblical justice, and it has its roots in the flood story from Genesis 6 to 9. In the story of the flood, God does not act out of anger or out of wrath. He regretted that his creation had been tainted. The text says that he was grieved in his heart. God does not delight in death. He does not relish taking away his life sustenance from the humans he created to be his image. Nevertheless, because the people chose to be separated from his source of life through their refusal to listen to his commandments, he brings judgment on them to bring justice to everyone else who actually is faithful to him. If people were allowed to worship other gods, that would mean that pagan rituals would continue, and that would lead to the worship of power, to sexual immorality, and in some cases, child sacrifice. A good and just God will stop that before it happens. And sometimes it's through God himself acting, like in the flood, or the ground swallowing people up. But he also acts through his commands for the rest of Israel to put these offenders to death. And that helps everyone else understand that they too have a responsibility in limiting the sin that happens in their community. And to be honest, a lot of times reading laws like this make us feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel uncomfortable. It sounds weird to us that evil needs to be purged from a land or a family or a people group. But this is the biblical framework for why God has to judge sin. If any case is too difficult for you to decide, between one kind of homicide or another, between one kind of lawsuit or another, and between one kind of assault or another, being cases of dispute in your courts, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. So you shall come to the Levitical priest, or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. Granted, even with all of these wise laws, there are bound to be situations just too complex for humans to figure out, even for a community of humans that are working together to accomplish God's word and will. In those cases, disputes are to be brought before priests and judges so they can bear their input. It works a lot like our modern system of hierarchical courts. You shall do according to the terms of the verdict which they declare to you, from that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to observe according to all that they teach you. According to the terms of the law which they teach you, and according to the verdict which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you, to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously, by not listening to the priest, who stands there to serve the Lord your God, nor to the judge, that man shall die. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid, and will not act presumptuously again. But Moses also stresses that once the priests have given their verdict, the people must follow it and see it through, even if they disagree. Moses reminds that these priests and judges have been specifically appointed by God to handle complex cases like this. To rebel against their wisdom would be doing evil. Moses commands that anyone who goes against these high court rulings ought to also die. This is, again, done to purge the evil out of Israel and to set an example for all of the rest of the people who might be tempted to rebel. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen. You shall set a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves, who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Eventually, Moses says, the people will appoint a king over them in the Promised Land. We know from 1 Samuel 8 that that is a whole other debacle, but even here, God in his foreknowledge is giving rules on how this king ought to act, even centuries before there's a monarchical system put in place. God says that first, the king should be an Israelite and not a foreigner. That's done again to limit the influence of pagan Canaanite false gods, and also envisioning a future Messiah who is the embodiment of a true Israelite. Then also, Moses commands that Israel's king should not act like a normal king. They aren't to be militaristic, building up their armies of horses and chariots, as the Egyptians were prone to do. They also aren't to be self-indulgent, amassing harems and building up treasures of silver and gold for themselves. Of course, all of these laws are pretty quickly broken by the monarchy in Israel, explicitly in the reign of Solomon, ultimately leading to the kingdom being split apart into two warring factions. But this passage serves as a template as to who we're looking for, the king that Israel needs, the Messiah that the world needs. Not a conqueror who indulges in hedonistic pleasures. We need a shepherd who will lead people in self-giving love. That's the kind of ruler Jesus is for us. And that's the kind of ruler we should be in our areas of influence. Now it shall come about, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. Now, a lot of times, us here in the West like to pretend that the idea of even royalty being subject to the law appeared out of thin air in 1215 with the Magna Carta. But here it is millennia earlier. Moses says that even the kings of Israel are to be subject to following God's word. They're supposed to keep a copy of the law with them at all times and to read from it every day. And this command plays a role in the story of King Josiah in 2 Kings 22. And so through the second half of this chapter, we see that if the kings and the priests, the highest, most powerful caste in Israel, if they continue to follow and obey God's word, if they study it and meditate on it and live it out in their day-to-day judgments, then they will stay humble and they can lead their people to do the same. And ultimately, all of Israel will endure in the land in a covenant with their God. The main problem is that as we continue reading the Bible, that doesn't happen. But in this chapter, we get important laws about how to carry out justice. We realize just how severe breaking God's covenant actually is. In refusing to follow God's word, we choose a path that separates us from God's source of life. That leads to death. And we see how communities are instructed to take accusations seriously, but also take accountability in the sin that has been committed in their midst. And at the end of this chapter, we see God's rules for the kings, giving us hope that one day someone will come that lives perfectly by God's standard and is able to set the world right. The good news is that's Jesus, and he is offering salvation and deliverance even to us today. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope that you have a good day, and God bless.